The knife was already in her hand before she remembered picking it up. Lyra Vance stood in the dark corner of a burning house, 6 years old, watching the world turn to ash around her. The smoke did not choke her the way it should have. She had learned, even then, in that first terrible hour, how to make her lungs slow down when everything else wanted to scream. A woman she did not recognize pulled her out through a broken window and told her not to look back. Lyra looked back anyway. She always looked back. It was the one rule she never obeyed. 15 years later, she still remembered the exact color of the flames against the night sky. Orange bleeding into a black that swallowed everything. She remembered the sound her mother's necklace made when it hit the floor, torn away by a soldier's careless hand. She remembered nothing of her mother's face. Grief, it turned out, was selective. It kept the wrong details and buried the ones that mattered. The Order of the Hollow Moon found her 3 days after the fire, starving and silent in the woods outside what used to be her home. They did not comfort her. They did not ask if she was hungry, or cold, or afraid. A woman with pale gray eyes and a voice like a closing door knelt in front of her and asked a single question. Do you want to be strong, or do you want to be safe? You cannot have both. Lyra, 7 years old and already understanding more about loss than most people learn in a lifetime, chose strong. What followed were 15 years of training that most people would call a nightmare, and the Order called an education. She learned to walk without sound across gravel. She learned to hold a blade so it became an extension of her arm rather than a foreign object. She learned to smile at a man twice her size and make him believe, completely and without doubt, that she found him fascinating, all while counting the beats of his pulse at his throat and calculating exactly how much pressure it would take to stop it. She was not the only orphan raised inside the stone walls of the Hollow Moon's mountain compound. There were dozens of them, boys and girls plucked from the wreckage of wars they were too young to understand, molded into instruments for a cause they were told to trust completely. Some of them broke early, unable to carry the weight of what they were becoming. Lyra watched 2 of her closest friends disappear in the night, and no one ever spoke their names again. She learned, from their silence, exactly what happened to those who could not finish what they started. She finished everything. By the time she turned 22, Lyra Vance had completed missions that would have made a hardened soldier lose sleep. She had walked into fortified strongholds wearing a borrowed name and a borrowed face, and walked out again leaving behind nothing but a locked door, and a man who would never wake up. She never lost sleep. She had trained herself out of the habit of dreaming, the same way she had trained herself out of flinching at loud noises, out of crying, out of wanting things for herself. There was only one thing she still wanted, and it had a name. Ronan Ashwood, the Alpha King. The man whose family had ordered the burning of her village, the massacre that had taken her parents, her brother, and every soft, warm thing about her childhood, all so that a rival pack could be crushed and a border redrawn in someone else's favor. She had grown up with his name whispered in the mountain halls like a curse, a target painted so vividly into her mind that she sometimes forgot he was an actual person, and not simply the shape of her own revenge. The morning the Order finally called her into the high chamber, Lyra felt something she had not felt in years. Not fear, not excitement, something closer to relief, the way a held breath feels when it is finally released. The woman with the gray eyes, older now, her hair fully silver, sat behind a table made of dark wood, and told Lyra what she had been waiting 15 years to hear. It is time. Lyra did not ask time for what, she already knew. The king holds a masquerade in 3 weeks, the woman continued, a gathering meant to parade eligible women before him, hoping he will finally choose a mate and secure the succession his council desperately wants. You will attend as a noblewoman from a minor pack seeking alliance. Your name will be Elena Thorne. Your accent, your history, your entire life story has already been built for you. Study it until it feels more real than your own. And once I am inside, Lyra asked, though she already understood the shape of the answer. You make him want you. You make him need you close. And when the moment is right, when no one is watching, and no one will ever suspect a woman he trusts, you finish what should have been finished the night your family burned. Lyra nodded once. There was no hesitation in the movement, no tremor in her hands. 15 years of training had made certain of that. And yet, somewhere beneath the surface, in a place she rarely allowed herself to visit, something old and forgotten stirred, quiet and unnamed, like a door creaking open in a house she thought had been sealed for good. She told herself it was nothing, anticipation maybe, the natural tension before any dangerous mission. She had felt something similar before every kill, a tightening in the chest that vanished the moment the work began. This would be no different, she told herself. A king was still just a man was still just a target, and a target, no matter how carefully guarded, no matter how powerful, was still just a problem waiting for the right solution. The 3 weeks that followed were the most demanding of her entire life, which was saying something for a woman who had once crossed an enemy border on a broken ankle without making a sound. She studied maps of the royal palace until she could walk its corridors in her sleep. She memorized the names, faces, and habits of every guard, every advisor, every servant who might recognize a stranger's unfamiliar step. She practiced Elena Thorne's laugh in front of a mirror until it no longer felt like a performance, until it felt like a second skin stretched over her own. The trainers pushed her harder than they ever had before, as if sensing that this final test would require more from her than any before it. She sparred until her knuckles split. She held her composure through interrogation drills designed to break lesser recruits. She learned 17 different ways to conceal a blade in clothing meant for dancing rather than fighting, and she learned all 17 so well that even she sometimes forgot where the metal was hidden until her fingers found it on instinct. On the night before she was to leave for the capital, the silver-haired woman came to her private quarters, an unusual gesture for someone who rarely showed anything resembling warmth. "You understand what waits for you if you fail," the woman said. It was not a question. "I understand," Lyra answered. "And you understand what waits for you if you succeed but hesitate, if you let sentiment cloud what needs to be done." Lyra almost laughed at the very suggestion. Sentiment, toward the man responsible for the worst night of her life. The idea seemed almost comical, a threat built for someone weaker, someone who had not spent 15 years hollowing herself out precisely so that no such weakness could ever take root. "There will be no hesitation," Lyra said, and she believed every word of it completely. The woman studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind those pale gray eyes, before she finally nodded and left without another word. Alone in the dark, Lyra allowed herself, just this once, to remember her mother's necklace hitting the floor. She let the sound echo through her mind, sharp and clear, the way she had trained herself never to allow except in these rare, controlled moments before a mission, when remembering served a purpose rather than a weakness. Tomorrow she would become someone else. Tomorrow she would step into a world of silk gowns and polished floors, and the false laughter of nobles who had never once known real hunger or real fear. Tomorrow she would look into the eyes of the man she had been raised to destroy, and she would smile at him the way she had practiced 10,000 times, and somewhere behind that smile, hidden in the small, cold place where she kept everything that mattered, she would carry the memory of a burning house and a mother's necklace, and a promise she had made before she was even old enough to fully understand what it would cost her to keep it. She packed a single bag that night, containing 3 gowns, a collection of borrowed jewelry, a small vial hidden inside a hollowed hairpin, and nothing else. She needed nothing else. Everything necessary for the mission had already been carved into her, patient and precise, over 15 long years. The carriage arrived before dawn. Lyra Vance climbed inside wearing the clothes of a woman named Elena Thorne, carrying the memory of a girl who no longer officially existed, and rode toward the capital with her spine straight and her expression calm, the very picture of a noblewoman traveling toward opportunity, rather than an assassin traveling toward the culmination of everything she had ever suffered. As the mountains gave way to open fields and the fields gave way to the first distant towers of the capital city, gleaming pale gold in the early light, Lyra allowed herself one final thought before locking her true self away completely. 15 years, she thought. 15 years for this single moment. She did not yet know that the moment waiting for her at the end of that road would demand something from her that no amount of training could have ever prepared her to give. The carriage rolled on, carrying her closer with every turn of its wheels, closer to the gates of a kingdom she had been taught to hate, closer to a king she had been raised to kill, and closer, though she could not have known it then, to the one thing her training had never once accounted for. The gates of the capital rose taller than anything Lyra had ever seen, carved from pale stone and crowned with iron wolves frozen mid-howl. She kept her chin level as the carriage passed beneath them, the way a noblewoman would, unimpressed by grandeur she had supposedly seen a dozen times before. Inside, her mind moved faster than her pulse, cataloging exits, counting guards, memorizing the rhythm of boots against marble. The masquerade of bonds was already in full bloom by the time she arrived, 3 days later, dressed in deep green silk that made her eyes look almost gold in candlelight. The ballroom stretched wider than the entire mountain compound where she had grown up, its ceiling painted with a sky full of stars that no longer matched the real one outside. Musicians filled the air with something light and forgettable, the kind of music built for forgetting your own name rather than remembering it. Women filled the room in waves of silk and jewels, daughters of minor packs and major ones alike, all of them hoping tonight would be the night the Alpha King finally looked their way and decided the search was over. Lyra watched them with something close to pity. They wanted a crown, she wanted a pulse to stop beating. She found her position near the edge of the room, close enough to observe, far enough to remain unremarkable. Unremarkable was a skill she had spent years perfecting, the art of being seen without being noticed, admired without being remembered. Tonight, however, she would need to break that habit, just once, just enough to catch the attention of the one man in the room whose attention actually mattered. She did not have to wait long. A ripple moved through the crowd the way wind moves through tall grass, and Lyra felt it before she saw the cause, the subtle shift of every head turning toward the same direction. She turned last, deliberately, the way a woman confident in her own worth might turn, unhurried and unimpressed. King Ronan Ashwood entered the ballroom flanked by 2 guards who kept a respectful distance, close enough to protect, far enough to allow him the illusion of freedom. He wore black, unadorned by the gold and jewels most royalty favored, as if refusing to compete with the room for attention he already commanded without effort. He was younger than she expected, though she supposed the reports she had memorized should have prepared her for that. Younger, and something else, something the files had never managed to capture. Tired. Not the exhaustion of a long night, but something older, worn into the set of his shoulders like a stone smoothed down by years of water. Lyra studied him the way she studied every target, searching for weaknesses, patterns, tells. She noted the careful distance he kept from the women who approached him, polite but unreachable. She noted the way his eyes swept the room constantly, never resting. A man perpetually checking for threats even in a room full of silk and music. Good, she thought. A cautious man was a predictable man, and predictable men were easy to plan around. What she had not planned for was the moment his eyes found hers. It happened quickly, almost accidentally, his gaze passing over the crowd the way it had passed over everyone else, until it reached her corner and simply stopped. Lyra did not look away first. She had learned long ago that looking away first was a form of surrender, and surrender was not something Elena Thorne would offer a king she had supposedly never met. He crossed the room toward her with unhurried steps, ignoring 3 separate women who tried to catch his attention along the way. Lyra felt something tighten low in her stomach, a familiar sensation she recognized as pure focus, the same feeling she got right before a blade found its mark. "You are the only person in this room not smiling at me," he said when he finally stood before her, close enough that she caught the faint scent of cedar and something like rain. "Perhaps I have not decided yet if you deserve one," Lyra answered, letting Elena Thorne's easy confidence carry the words. Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or the first genuine amusement he had shown all evening. "Bold words for someone in my ballroom." "Bold words are the only kind worth saying," she said. "Anything else is simply noise." He studied her for a long moment, and Lyra held perfectly still beneath that gaze, forcing her breathing to remain slow and even, despite the strange awareness crawling up her spine. She reminded herself, silently and firmly, exactly who stood in front of her, and exactly why she had traveled so far to find him. "Dance with me," he said, and it was not quite a request, though it was not quite a command either. Something in between, an offer he clearly expected few women to refuse. Lyra inclined her head, allowing herself the smallest, most calculated smile. "If you insist, Your Majesty." His hand found hers, warm and steady, and he led her onto the floor, as the musicians shifted into something slower, something that required closeness rather than distance. Lyra had danced with dozens of men during her training, practicing the exact pressure of a hand at a waist, the exact rhythm needed to make a man forget everything except the woman in front of him. None of that training had prepared her for the strange awareness that settled over her now, standing this close to the man she had been raised to kill, feeling the solid warmth of his hand against her back, and the steady, unhurried way he moved. Nothing like the arrogant swagger she had expected from a king. "You are not from a pack I recognize," he said as they moved together. "A small one," Lyra answered smoothly, reciting the history built for her weeks ago. "Far to the east. We keep to ourselves, mostly. My father thought it was time to change that." "And what do you think?" The question caught her slightly off guard, not because it was difficult, but because it was the first time all evening someone had asked what she thought, rather than what her father wanted, or her pack needed. "I think opportunities should be taken when they present themselves," she said, which was true in more ways than he could possibly understand. He smiled at that, a real smile, not the practiced expression she imagined he wore for most of the room, a philosophy I can respect. They danced through 2 full songs before he finally released her hand, though his eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary. I find myself wanting to know more about this small pack from the east, Elena Thorne, he said, testing her false name carefully, as if trying it out for the first time. Then perhaps you should invite me to stay a while longer, Lyra said, delivering the line exactly as she had rehearsed it 100 times in front of a mirror. Perhaps I will. He did not simply perhaps. Within the hour, a royal steward approached her with an invitation formally extended by the crown itself, offering her rooms within the palace for the duration of what was described as ongoing alliance discussions between her pack and the throne. Lyra accepted with practiced grace, thanking the steward with exactly the right amount of gratitude and exactly the right amount of composure. Alone in the carriage that carried her belongings to the palace later that night, Lyra allowed herself a single breath of genuine satisfaction. Everything had gone according to plan, better than according to plan. She was inside. She had his attention, his curiosity, and soon, if her training held true, his trust. And yet, as the palace gates rose ahead of her, gleaming under torchlight, Lyra found herself replaying the sound of his laugh rather than the details of his guard rotation, and she pushed the thought away with more force than she expected it to require. It meant nothing, she told herself. A momentary distraction, easily managed, easily forgotten. She had 15 years of discipline behind her, 15 years of training designed specifically to prevent exactly this kind of foolishness. The carriage rolled to a stop beneath towering palace walls, and Lyra Vance, wearing the face of a woman who did not exist, stepped out into the life of a king who did not yet know he was already marked for death, carrying with her a plan 15 years in the making, and, though she refused to acknowledge it, the very first crack in the armor she had spent her entire life building. The rooms given to her were closer to the king's private chambers than any guest quarters had a right to be, a fact Lyra noted the very first night with quiet satisfaction. From her window she could see the eastern garden and, beyond it, a narrow servants' corridor that connected directly to the royal wing. She memorized the distance in footsteps before she even unpacked her bags. Mornings inside the palace moved differently than she expected. She had imagined a court thick with whispering nobles and constant performance, and while that certainly existed in the grand halls, her own days quickly settled into something quieter. Meetings labeled as alliance discussions turned out to be long, careful conversations between herself, a rotating handful of royal advisors, and, more often than she anticipated, the king himself. You did not strike me as someone who enjoys trade negotiations, Ronan said on the third morning, finding her alone in the palace library where she had gone to study a map disguised as idle curiosity. I do not, Lyra admitted, closing the map with practiced ease. But my father insisted I understand every detail before committing our pact to anything permanent. A careful man. A man who lost too much to carelessness once, she said, and the words came easier than she expected. Borrowed truth wrapped around a borrowed name. Ronan studied her for a long moment, something unreadable behind his eyes. I understand that kind of caution better than you might think. Lyra filed the comment away, another small piece of a man she was supposed to be building a case against, not a picture of. She reminded herself, again, that curiosity about her target was simply good tradecraft. Understanding a man's history made it easier to predict his movements, easier to know exactly when his guard would be lowest. Over the following days, Ronan sought her out with increasing frequency, always with some plausible reason. A council meeting he thought she might find informative, a walk through the Eastern Garden to discuss border logistics, a late supper to review documents that could easily have been reviewed by messenger. Lyra played her role perfectly each time, charming without appearing to try, insightful without appearing threatening, exactly the kind of woman a busy king might find himself unable to stop thinking about. What she had not planned for was how easy it became. She began noticing things about him that had nothing to do with strategy, the way he ate dinner alone most nights, even when surrounded by advisors eager to fill the silence with flattery, the way his shoulders dropped, just slightly, the moment the doors closed and the performance of kingship was no longer required. The scar along his jaw that he never explained and no one else dared ask about. You watch people very carefully, he observed one evening, catching her studying him across a nearly empty council chamber long after the other advisors had left. Habit, Lyra said, recovering quickly. My father always said a person's face tells you more than their words ever will. And what does my face tell you? The question hung in the air between them, more dangerous than he could possibly know. Lyra considered lying, considered offering something flattering and forgettable the way Elena Thorne might. Instead, something in her chose honesty, or a version close enough to pass for it. That you are tired, she said quietly, more tired than a man your age should be. Something shifted in his expression, surprise giving way to something rawer. "Careful," he said, though his tone held no threat. "Few people say such things to my face. Would you prefer I lied?" "No," he said, and the word carried more weight than she expected. "I would not." That night, alone in her rooms, Lyra sat by the window and stared out at the dark garden without truly seeing it. She reviewed her training in her mind, reciting the lessons like a prayer meant to steady shaking hands, except her hands were not shaking, which somehow felt worse. She catalogued the day's conversations, searching for tactical advantage, useful information, anything that justified the growing list of small human details she had gathered about a man she was supposed to view only as a target. She found nothing useful. She found only a man who are alone more than any king should, who carried guilt she did not yet understand the shape of, who asked questions no one had trained her to expect, and answered with more honesty than any target should ever offer an assassin. 3 days later, Ronan invited her to accompany him and a small group of guards on a routine inspection of the palace's outer grounds, an activity he explained as necessary but tedious, the kind of duty a king could rarely avoid. Lyra accepted, recognizing the opportunity to study the palace's exterior defenses under the guise of simple companionship. They walked in comfortable silence for much of the inspection, Ronan pausing occasionally to speak with guards or examine a section of wall that needed repair. Lyra used the time exactly as intended, memorizing patrol patterns and weak points in the outer defenses, filing everything away with the same careful precision she applied to every mission. It was during a quiet stretch near the eastern wall, far enough from the guards to allow private conversation, that Ronan spoke without prompting. "My father built half these walls higher after a conflict early in his reign," he said, staring up at the stone. "A border dispute that ended badly for everyone involved. He never spoke of it directly, not once, not even near the end of his life." Lyra's entire body went still, though she forced her expression to remain neutral, curious rather than alarmed. "What happened?" "A village was destroyed," Ronan said quietly, and something in his voice suggested this was not idle conversation, but a confession he rarely offered anyone. "Innocent people, from what I understand. My father claimed it was necessary, a strategic move against a rival pack encroaching on our territory. I was young when it happened. I only learned the full truth years later, piecing together fragments no one wanted to discuss openly." Lyra kept her breathing steady through sheer force of will, every instinct screaming at her to demand more details, to finally hear the full story of the night that had taken everything from her. Instead, she asked the question a curious stranger might ask, careful and measured. "Does it trouble you? Something that happened before you ever held the crown?" Ronan was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Lyra wondered if she had pushed too far. When he finally answered, his voice carried a weight she had not expected from a king raised to believe his family's decisions were always justified. "It troubles me more than anything else I carry," he said. "I inherited a crown built partly on decisions I would never have made myself, and I have spent every year since trying to be a different kind of king than my father was. Whether I have succeeded, I honestly could not tell you." Lyra said nothing for a long moment, watching him stare out at the wall his father had built, a monument to violence he clearly wished he could tear down along with the guilt it represented. She had spent 15 years imagining the man responsible for her family's destruction as a monster without conscience, without regret, without a single redeeming quality worth acknowledging. She had not imagined this. A man burdened by inherited guilt, working quietly to become someone his father would not recognize, someone worthy of a crown he seemed to view more as punishment than privilege. It changed nothing about her mission, she told herself firmly as they walked back toward the palace in silence. A target's personal regrets did not erase the actions of his bloodline, did not undo the fire that had taken her family, did not release her from a vow made when she was 7 years old, and burning inside with grief too large for such a small body to contain. And yet, that night, lying awake in the darkness of her borrowed rooms, Lyra Vance found herself thinking not of blades and pressure points and the exact moment she might finally complete her mission, but of a king standing beneath a wall built from his father's guilt, quietly carrying a weight she had never once considered he might share. For the first time since she was 7 years old, the plan she had spent her entire life preparing to execute no longer felt as simple as it once had. Word arrived at the palace on a gray morning that a border skirmish had broken out near the eastern territories, close enough to the capital that Ronan chose to ride out personally, rather than send commanders in his place. Lyra learned of the decision through a hurried conversation between 2 advisors in the hallway outside the council chamber, and before she fully understood her own intentions, she found herself requesting permission to accompany the riding party. "This is not a diplomatic excursion," Ronan told her when she made the request directly. His expression caught somewhere between amusement and genuine concern. "There will be fighting." "I am aware," Lyra said simply. "I am also capable of far more than pouring tea and discussing trade agreements, Your Majesty." Something in her tone must have convinced him, or perhaps he simply lacked the time to argue further given the urgency of the situation. Within the hour, Lyra found herself riding at the edge of a small company of soldiers, dressed in borrowed leather rather than silk, a concealed blade at her hip that felt more natural against her body than any of the jewelry she had worn for weeks. The skirmish itself, when they arrived, was smaller than the report suggested, a border dispute that had escalated into open combat between royal soldiers and a group of raiders testing the strength of the kingdom's defenses. Lyra moved through the chaos with the fluid precision of 15 years of training, though she was careful to disguise the full extent of her skill, offering just enough competence to justify her presence without revealing the true depth of what she was capable of. It happened quickly, the way real danger always did. A raider broke through the front line, moving directly toward a young guard who had stumbled, weapon knocked from his hand, completely exposed. Lyra did not think. She simply moved, closing the distance in seconds, disarming the raider with a technique that would have taken any ordinary noblewoman years to master, and left him unconscious on the ground before the guard even fully understood what had happened. She realized her mistake the moment she turned and found Ronan watching her from several paces away, his expression unreadable, sword still in hand from his own portion of the fighting. "That was not the movement of a woman who spends her days discussing trade agreements," he said quietly once the skirmish had ended and the raiders had either fled or been captured. Lyra's mind raced through a dozen possible explanations, each one more convincing than the last, though she found herself hesitating, unable to immediately settle on a lie. "My father believed every daughter should know how to defend herself," she finally offered. "Given the isolation of our territory, self-sufficiency became a necessity rather than a luxury." Ronan studied her for a long moment, and Lyra held her breath, waiting for suspicion to harden into something more dangerous. Instead, something almost like admiration crossed his face. "Remarkable," he said simply. "Most nobles I know would have fled at the first sign of danger." That night, back within the palace walls, Ronan sought her out again, though this time the conversation carried none of the careful distance of their earlier exchanges. They sat together in a small private study, a fire burning low in the hearth, and for the first time since her arrival, Ronan spoke without the practiced restraint of a king performing for an audience. "I never wanted this crown," he admitted, staring into the flames rather than at her. "My older brother was meant to inherit it. He died when I was 16, an accident during a hunting expedition that never fully made sense to me, though no one ever suggested anything beyond misfortune. I was thrust into a role I never trained for, forced to become a king while still grieving a brother I loved more than anything." Lyra listened, something tightening painfully in her chest that had nothing to do with strategy or mission planning. That must have been an impossible burden. "It still is," he said quietly. "Every decision I make, I wonder if he would have made it better. I wonder if the people who died under my father's orders, before my time, might have been saved under different leadership. I carry guilt for things I never personally chose, and some days it feels heavier than any crown should ever be allowed to feel." Something in Lyra broke slightly at those words, a crack spreading through the careful foundation she had spent 15 years building. She thought of her own family, of the fire, of the vow she had made as a child too young to understand the true cost of vengeance. She thought of the woman with gray eyes who had trained her to see this man as nothing more than a target, a symbol of everything that had been taken from her. She had not been trained to see him as someone who might have wept for the same losses, in his own private way, that she had spent her entire life avenging. "You carry more than you should," Lyra said softly, the words slipping out before she could stop them, more honest than anything Elena Thorne had ever said. Ronan looked up at her then, something vulnerable flickering across his features. "You are the only person who has ever said that to me, without wanting something in return." The statement landed like a blade between her ribs, sharper than anything she had faced on the battlefield. Because she did want something from him, something so far beyond anything he could imagine, something that had brought her into his life under false pretenses built entirely on a lie. She should have felt satisfaction at how close she had gotten, how thoroughly she had earned his trust, exactly as her training had intended. Instead, she felt something closer to shame, an emotion she had not experienced since childhood, since the earliest days of her training when weakness still occasionally slipped through the cracks of her discipline. "You should be careful who you trust," she said, and the warning carried more truth than he could possibly understand. "Perhaps," Ronan said, studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, despite every instinct telling her to remain composed. "But something tells me you are exactly the kind of person worth trusting." Lyra said nothing, unable to trust her own voice in that moment, watching the firelight flicker across a face that no longer felt like the face of a target, but something far more complicated, something her training had never once accounted for. Later that night, alone in her rooms, she pressed her palm against the cool glass of her window and stared out at the darkened garden, trying to reconstruct the careful walls she had built around herself since childhood. She recited the facts of her mission like a mantra. His family had ordered the massacre that took her parents. His bloodline was responsible for the fire that had shaped every single day of her existence since she was 7 years old. None of his personal grief erased that truth, no matter how genuine it appeared, no matter how much it resembled her own. And yet, for the first time since accepting this mission, Lyra found herself questioning not whether she could complete it, but whether completing it would truly settle the debt she had spent her entire life believing needed to be paid. The crack in her armor, small and quiet since the masquerade, had widened into something she could no longer ignore, no matter how desperately she wished otherwise. A rider arrived at the palace gates 3 weeks after the border skirmish, carrying no royal seal, no formal announcement, only a folded note delivered quietly into Lyra's hand by a servant girl who claimed not to know its origin. Lyra recognized the handwriting immediately, precise and cold, the same hand that had signed her earliest training assignments as a child. The message was brief. 3 days remained before the order expected the mission complete. Failure would not be tolerated, and a replacement had already been prepared should Lyra prove unable to finish what she started. She burned the note over a candle flame that night, watching the paper curl and blacken, until nothing remained but ash, a small, private echo of the fire that had started all of this 15 years earlier. Her hands, she noticed with something between relief and disappointment, did not shake at all. The following morning, she requested a private audience with a handler the order had stationed within the capital, disguised as a traveling merchant who occasionally supplied rare herbs to the palace kitchens. The meeting took place in a narrow alley behind the market square, shadows thick enough to hide 2 women who had no business speaking to one another in the open. "You are behind schedule," the handler said without preamble, her voice sharp with impatience. "The council is losing patience. They believe you have grown comfortable in your position rather than committed to your purpose." "I have gathered everything necessary," Lyra said, keeping her voice level despite something tightening uncomfortably in her chest. "The opportunity has simply not yet presented itself." "Opportunities are created, not waited for," the handler snapped. "You know this. You were trained better than this hesitation suggests." Lyra said nothing, unable to argue against an accusation that struck closer to the truth than she wanted to admit even to herself. The handler studied her for a long moment, something calculating behind her eyes. 3 days, the handler repeated. "If the mission remains incomplete, someone else will be sent to finish it, and you will be dealt with according to the order's standard protocol for failed operatives." The threat required no elaboration. Lyra had witnessed the standard protocol firsthand, more than once, watching operatives who failed their assignments disappear from the mountain compound without explanation or ceremony. She understood exactly what awaited her should she fail to complete what she had come here to do. That night she prepared everything with the same methodical precision she applied to every mission. She reviewed the palace's nightly guard rotations, confirmed the specific hour when Ronan's personal guards changed shifts and left a narrow window of vulnerability outside his private chambers. She prepared the poison hidden inside her hollowed hairpin, a substance so refined it would leave no trace beyond what appeared to be a natural failure of the heart. Tragic but unremarkable for a man who worked himself constantly to exhaustion. She told herself, repeatedly, that this was simply the completion of a debt 15 years overdue. She told herself the personal conversations, the shared vulnerabilities, the strange warmth that had grown between them, meant nothing beyond the natural byproduct of a mission executed with skill. She told herself that a target's regret did not erase the crimes of his bloodline, that grief for a lost brother did not undo the fire that had taken her entire family. She told herself many things that night, and somewhere beneath the careful architecture of her own justifications, she recognized the growing distance between what she was telling herself and what she actually believed. The following evening, she chose her moment carefully. Ronan had dismissed most of his advisors early, citing exhaustion after a long day of council meetings regarding trade disputes along the southern border. His personal guards, following their usual rotation, would not check his chambers again until well past midnight, leaving a window of nearly 2 hours during which Lyra could complete her mission and return to her own rooms without suspicion. She moved through the palace corridors with practiced silence, every step calculated to avoid the specific floorboards known to creak, every shadow used precisely to remain unseen. Her heart, she noticed distantly, beat at a steady, controlled rhythm, exactly as it always had before every previous mission. She reached the door to Ronan's private chambers and paused only long enough to confirm the corridor remained empty before slipping inside. He was awake, seated near the fire with a book open on his lap, though his eyes were fixed on the flames rather than the pages. He looked up when she entered, surprise flickering across his features, quickly replaced by something warmer. "I did not expect a visitor tonight," he said, setting the book aside. "I could not sleep," Lyra said, the lie coming easily despite everything churning beneath the surface. "I thought perhaps you might feel the same." "You know me well already," Ronan said, gesturing toward the chair across from his own. Lyra crossed the room slowly, her fingers finding the hollowed hairpin tucked carefully into her hair, exactly where 15 years of training had taught her to keep it. She sat across from him, close enough that completing her mission would require nothing more than a moment's distraction, a single unguarded breath, a cup of wine already poured and waiting on the table between them. "You look troubled," Ronan observed, studying her with the same careful attention he always seemed to offer her, as if she were the only puzzle in the room worth solving. "I have been thinking about something you said," Lyra admitted, her fingers tightening slightly around the hairpin. "About the guilt you carry for things you never personally chose." Ronan's expression softened. "And what conclusions have you reached?" Lyra opened her mouth to answer, though the words that emerged surprised even herself. "I think perhaps guilt inherited from others is the heaviest kind to carry, because there is no clear way to atone for it. You cannot undo what was already done before you had any power to stop it." "No," Ronan agreed quietly, "you cannot. All you can do is try to become someone different, someone your father would not recognize, and hope that counts for something in the end." Something in his voice, raw and honest in a way few kings would ever allow themselves to be, undid the last remaining thread of Lyra's certainty. She thought of the fire again, the necklace hitting the floor, the vow she had made as a grieving child who understood nothing of nuance or complexity, only the simple, burning need for someone to pay for what had been taken from her. She looked at the man in front of her, carrying guilt for a father's crimes with more sincerity than she had ever witnessed from anyone, royal or otherwise, and she understood, with sudden and devastating clarity, that killing him would not bring her family back. It would not undo the fire, it would only add another death to a ledger already overflowing with them, another grieving family somewhere in this kingdom left to carry a weight they never chose either. Her fingers released the hairpin. "Lyra?" Ronan asked, using her actual name for the first time, and she froze completely, certain for one horrifying moment that he somehow knew everything. "I did not tell you that name," she said carefully, her mind racing. "You spoke it in your sleep," he admitted, something almost sheepish in his expression. "The night you fell asleep in the library after our discussion of trade routes. I did not mention it because I assumed you had your reasons for the deception, and I found myself unwilling to press the matter." Lyra stared at him, understanding slowly dawning that he had known, or at least suspected, that Elena Thorne was not entirely who she claimed to be, and he had chosen, for reasons she could not yet fully understand, to remain silent rather than confront her. She rose from her chair abruptly, unable to remain in the same room a moment longer, her carefully constructed composure finally shattering completely. "I need air," she said, and fled before he could respond, leaving behind a king who watched her go with quiet, patient confusion, and a mission that remained, for the first time in 15 years of flawless execution, entirely and deliberately unfinished. Lyra did not return to her rooms that night. Instead, she walked the eastern garden until the sky turned pale gray with the first hints of dawn, her mind a battlefield more chaotic than any physical fight she had ever survived. She had failed, not through incompetence, not through discovery, but through her own hand, her own choice, a decision that 15 years of training had never once prepared her to make. She understood exactly what waited for her now. The order did not tolerate hesitation, and hesitation was precisely what she had shown, standing in a king's private chambers with every advantage required to complete her mission, only to release the weapon she had carried for that exact purpose. The handler found her before she made it back inside the palace walls, emerging from the shadows near the garden's outer gate with an expression that promised nothing good. "You had him," the handler said, her voice cold with barely restrained fury. "Alone, unguarded, every opportunity in your hands, and you did nothing." "The situation was more complicated than anticipated," Lyra said, though even to her own ears the excuse sounded hollow. The order does not care about complications, the handler said. You have failed your final assignment. Your replacement has already been dispatched. You have until sunset to complete the mission yourself, or the order will consider your usefulness at an end entirely. The threat was unmistakable now, no longer simply a warning about failed operatives being dealt with through standard protocol, but a direct statement that Lyra herself would become a target if she did not finish what she started. She had known, intellectually, that this possibility existed. Standing before it directly, however, felt entirely different from imagining it in the abstract. She spent the remaining hours of the morning in a state of controlled panic, pacing her rooms while attempting to construct a plan that would satisfy the order, without requiring her to complete the one action she now found herself completely unable to justify. She considered fleeing the capital entirely, disappearing into some distant territory where the order's reach could not follow. She considered warning Ronan directly, though the idea of confessing everything to the man she had been sent to kill felt like walking directly into her own execution. She was still turning over impossible options when a commotion erupted in the palace's outer courtyard, shouts and the clash of steel carrying clearly through her open window. Lyra moved instantly, instinct overriding hesitation, and reached the courtyard within minutes to find chaos already unfolding. A figure dressed in dark, unmarked clothing moved through the courtyard with lethal efficiency, cutting down 2 royal guards before a third managed to raise an alarm loud enough to draw reinforcements. Lyra recognized the fighting style immediately, precise and economical, every movement stripped of wasted motion. The order's replacement had arrived, and rather than seeking a quiet, undetectable kill, they appeared to have decided a public assassination attempt would suffice, perhaps as punishment directed as much at Lyra's failure as at the king himself. She did not think before acting. She simply moved, drawing the blade she still carried and intercepting the assassin before he could reach the inner courtyard where Ronan, drawn by the commotion, had just emerged flanked by only 2 guards. The fight that followed was brutal and fast, 2 operatives trained by the same brutal methods clashing with equal skill, each blow met by an equally precise counter. Lyra fought with a desperation she had never allowed herself before, understanding with absolute clarity that this fight represented far more than simply protecting a target. She was fighting for the possibility of a different future than the one 15 years of training had mapped out for her. She finally disarmed the assassin with a technique that left him unconscious against the courtyard stones, breathing hard, her hands trembling now with the first genuine adrenaline she had felt in years. When she turned, she found Ronan watching her, along with every guard who had witnessed the entire exchange, and understood immediately that there was no explanation remaining that could preserve the fiction of Elena Thorne. "Take her into custody," Ronan said, his voice flat and controlled in a way Lyra had never heard from him before, stripped of every warmth their private conversations had contained, along with the other one. The guards moved to obey, and Lyra did not resist, understanding that resistance now would only confirm every dangerous assumption forming behind Ronan's carefully guarded expression. She allowed herself to be led away into the palace's lower levels, into a cell that smelled of damp stone and old iron, and she sat alone in the darkness with nothing but the sound of her own breathing and the weight of everything she had just lost. Hours passed before anyone came for her. When the cell door finally opened, it was not a guard who entered, but Ronan himself, alone, carrying a single lantern that cast long shadows across the stone walls between them. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice carrying none of the warmth she had grown accustomed to, only a cold, exhausted demand for truth. "Every single detail, starting with your real name." Lyra studied him for a long moment, understanding that this moment would determine everything that followed, and finally, for the first time since arriving at the palace weeks earlier, she chose complete honesty. "My name is Lyra Vance," she said quietly. "I was 7 years old when your father's forces burned my village to the ground during a border conflict 15 years ago. My parents died in that fire. I was found afterward by an organization called the Hollow Moon, and they raised me, trained me, for exactly this purpose, to become close enough to you that I could end your life as payment for what your family took from mine." Ronan's expression remained carefully controlled, though something flickered behind his eyes, pain perhaps, or the specific horror of hearing a truth he had perhaps already begun to suspect. "And tonight, why did the assassin attack instead of you?" "Because I failed," Lyra said, her voice breaking slightly despite every effort to keep it steady. "I had the opportunity, alone in your chambers, everything necessary to complete the mission, and I could not do it. Not because I lacked the skill, but because somewhere during these past weeks, I stopped seeing you as simply the son of the man who destroyed my family, and started seeing you as someone carrying his own grief, his own guilt. Someone who reminded me that the world is rarely as simple as 15 years of training taught me to believe. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, broken only by the faint sound of dripping water somewhere deeper in the cell block. Ronan set the lantern down slowly, studying her with an expression she could not fully read, anger, and something else warring visibly across his features. "You came here to kill me," he said finally, "and yet tonight you fought to protect me instead." "Yes," Lyra said simply, offering no further justification, understanding that any additional explanation would sound like manipulation rather than truth. Ronan was quiet for a long moment, staring at her through the dim lantern light, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried something Lyra had not expected to hear. "I need time," he said. "Time to understand what to believe, what to trust, and what to do with everything you have just told me. But I am not ready to execute the woman who saved my life tonight, regardless of what brought her into my palace in the first place." He left without another word, taking the lantern with him and leaving Lyra alone once more in the darkness, though this time the darkness felt different, heavier with uncertainty but lighter, somehow, with the strange and fragile possibility of something she had never once imagined herself deserving. 3 days passed before Ronan returned to the cell, and in that time Lyra had nothing but stone walls and her own thoughts for company. She used the silence the way her training had taught her, sorting through everything that had happened since her arrival at the palace, searching for the exact moment her certainty had first begun to crack. She could not find a single moment. It had happened slowly, invisibly, the way water eventually wears down even the hardest stone, until one day the shape of something had simply changed without announcement. When Ronan finally appeared again, he came with 2 guards who unlocked her cell and escorted her, not to an execution block as she had half expected, but to a private council chamber, where a handful of trusted advisors waited alongside him. Lyra entered with her wrists bound but her spine straight, refusing to enter the room as anything less than herself, whoever that turned out to be now that Elena Thorne no longer existed. "Sit," Ronan said, gesturing toward a chair positioned at the center of the room. Lyra sat, meeting his gaze steadily despite the uncertainty churning beneath her calm exterior. "I have spent 3 days investigating everything you told me," Ronan said, "and 3 days learning things about my own father's reign that I never fully understood before now. The border conflict you described, the destruction of your village, it happened exactly as you said. However, the deeper I investigated, the more I discovered discrepancies that troubled me far beyond the tragedy itself." He nodded to one of his advisors, an older woman with sharp eyes who stepped forward carrying a stack of documents. "Records recovered from that period suggest the conflict was manufactured," the advisor explained. "Intelligence reports my father received, claiming your village harbored raiders responsible for attacks along our border, were falsified. We have traced the origin of those false reports to an informant working directly for a rival pack, one that has spent decades quietly working to destabilize relations between the throne and smaller territories." Lyra felt the ground shift beneath everything she had believed for 15 years. "You are saying my village was destroyed based on a lie?" "Yes," Ronan said quietly. "A lie constructed specifically to provoke my father into an act of violence that would weaken both our kingdoms simultaneously, sowing distrust and creating exactly the kind of grievance that could later be exploited." "Exploited how?" Lyra asked, though some cold, calculating part of her mind had already begun assembling the answer before he finished speaking. "By raising a survivor of that same tragedy," Ronan said, "training her from childhood with a singular purpose, and eventually sending her to complete what the original manufactured conflict had started 15 years earlier, removing me from the throne entirely, leaving the kingdom vulnerable to exactly the kind of instability our enemies have been patiently waiting for." Lyra sat in stunned silence, understanding slowly unfolding with the particular horror of realizing that even her deepest grief, the very foundation of everything she had become, had been shaped and exploited by forces far beyond her own understanding. The Hollow Moon had not simply found an orphan child and offered her purpose. They had cultivated a weapon from a tragedy they themselves had helped orchestrate, ensuring that weapon would eventually be pointed exactly where they wanted it. "The Hollow Moon," Lyra said slowly. "They are not simply an organization dedicated to justice for the wronged. They are working for the very people responsible for the lie that destroyed my family in the first place." "That is our belief," Ronan confirmed, "though we have not yet confirmed the full extent of their involvement or identified every person responsible for orchestrating this over so many years." Lyra closed her eyes briefly, feeling something inside her both break and settle simultaneously. 15 years of grief, of training, of a singular purpose that had defined every waking moment of her life, and none of it had been entirely what she believed it to be. Her hatred, so carefully cultivated and sharpened over a decade and a half, had been a tool wielded by hands she had never even known existed. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Ronan studied her for a long moment before answering. "Now, we uncover the truth completely, and we stop whoever orchestrated this before they can attempt something similar again, whether through you or through someone else raised the same way you were." "And me?" Lyra asked, the question carrying more vulnerability than she had allowed herself to show in 15 years. "You saved my life," Ronan said simply. "Whatever brought you into my palace, whatever lies shaped your entire childhood, the choice you made in my chambers that night was entirely your own. I am not interested in punishing someone for refusing to become exactly what others designed her to be." Something in Lyra's chest loosened at those words, a tightness she had carried for so long she had forgotten it was even there. "Why are you helping me understand this? You have every reason to distrust me completely." "Because," Ronan said, his voice quieter now, more personal, "somewhere during these past weeks, before I ever suspected any of this, I found myself caring for the woman who challenged me at that masquerade, who told me I looked tired when everyone else only ever told me what they thought I wanted to hear. I am not willing to simply discard that because the circumstances surrounding it turned out to be more complicated than either of us anticipated." The advisors exchanged glances, clearly uncertain how to respond to such a personal admission delivered in front of them, though none dared interrupt. Lyra held Ronan's gaze, understanding that this moment marked something far larger than the resolution of a single mission gone wrong. It marked the beginning of an entirely different path, one neither the hollow moon nor whatever conspiracy had shaped her childhood had ever intended her to walk. "I want to help you find them," Lyra said firmly. "Whoever orchestrated this, whoever used my family's death and my entire childhood as a tool in some larger scheme, I want to help stop them completely." Ronan nodded slowly, something like relief passing across his features. "Then let us begin immediately. We have wasted enough time already, and I suspect whoever is responsible for this will not remain patient once they realize their carefully constructed plan has failed." He gestured, and one of the guards stepped forward to remove the bindings from Lyra's wrists, an act that felt far more significant than the simple release of rope. Lyra flexed her fingers slowly, feeling something like hope stirring in a place that had been carefully hollowed out for 15 long years. "Where do we begin?" she asked. "With the hollow moon," Ronan said grimly, "and with whoever within my own father's old court might have played a role in manufacturing the lie that started all of this in the first place." The council chamber fell into focused, purposeful activity as advisors began gathering documents and maps, and Lyra found herself, for the first time since childhood, working toward a purpose she had chosen entirely for herself, rather than one carved into her by grief, manipulation, and 15 years of careful, calculated deception. The investigation moved quickly once Lyra and Ronan combined their knowledge, her intimate understanding of the Hollow Moon's structure, paired with the royal advisor's access to decades of court records. Within a week, they had identified the informant responsible for the falsified reports that led to the destruction of Lyra's village, a courtier named Edwin Halloway who had served Ronan's father for nearly 30 years before quietly retiring to a remote estate shortly after the conflict concluded. "He disappeared from public life almost immediately after the attack on your village," an advisor named Cora explained, spreading a series of documents across the council table. "Officially, he claimed exhaustion after decades of service. Unofficially, we believe he was removed from court once his usefulness to whoever employed him had been exhausted." "Employed him," Lyra repeated. "You believe he was working for someone specific, not simply acting out of personal ambition." "The timing is too precise for coincidence," Cora said. "The false intelligence reports appeared exactly when tensions between the throne and the rival pack in question had reached a critical point. Someone benefited enormously from pushing that conflict toward open violence, and Edwin Halloway's fingerprints are all over the documentation that made it happen." Lyra studied the map spread before them, tracing the location of Halloway's remote estate with careful attention. "If he is still alive, he may be the only person who can confirm exactly who orchestrated this, and whether the Hollow Moon was complicit from the very beginning, or simply exploited afterward. Then we pay him a visit," Ronan said, already moving toward the door. "Quietly, before word of our investigation reaches whoever might still be protecting him." They departed the following morning with a small, carefully selected escort, traveling under the guise of a routine inspection of the kingdom's northern territories, rather than drawing attention to their true purpose. Lyra rode beside Ronan for most of the journey, the easy silence between them occasionally broken by conversation that felt entirely different from the careful performances of their earlier acquaintance. You have not asked me why I chose to trust you, Ronan said on the second day of travel, guiding his horse alongside hers along a narrow forest path. I assumed you had your reasons, Lyra said, though I confess I have wondered. Because trust built entirely on comfortable truths is worthless, Ronan said. You told me things about yourself that could have gotten you executed, when silence would have been far easier. That kind of honesty, delivered at genuine risk to yourself, tells me more about your character than a lifetime of pleasant conversation ever could. Lyra considered his words carefully, something warm settling in her chest despite the seriousness of their mission. I have spent 15 years being trained to lie convincingly. It is strange, discovering that honesty feels far more difficult, and somehow far more important. Difficult things usually are the ones worth doing, Ronan said, and something in his tone suggested he was speaking about more than simply their current conversation. They reached Holloway's estate on the fourth day, a modest manor tucked into a valley far removed from the political currents of the capital. The old courtier, now well into his 70s, received them with visible unease once he recognized Ronan despite the plain traveling clothes meant to disguise his identity. Your Majesty, Holloway said, bowing stiffly, his eyes darting nervously toward the small escort waiting outside. I confess I did not expect a visit from the crown after so many years. Then you understand exactly why we have come, Ronan said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who no longer needed to raise it to command a room. We know about the falsified reports, Edwin. We know about the village destroyed based on lies you helped construct. What we do not yet know is who instructed you to construct them. Holloway's composure crumbled almost immediately, decades of guilt apparently having worn away whatever resolve might have once allowed him to maintain his silence indefinitely. I was young, he said, his voice trembling, ambitious, and foolish enough to believe the promises made to me. I did not fully understand at the time the scale of what I was helping to orchestrate. Who approached you? Lyra asked, stepping forward, unable to keep the tension from her voice. Holloway looked at her directly for the first time, something like recognition flickering across his aged features. You, he said slowly. You are from that village, aren't you? I can see it in your eyes, the same anger I saw in the survivors' faces the day after the attack, when I visited under false pretenses to assess the damage my own lies had caused. Who approached you? Lyra repeated, her voice hardening. Holloway sank into a nearby chair, suddenly looking every one of his 70-plus years. A woman, he said quietly, silver-haired, even then, though younger than she must be now. She represented herself as working for interests aligned against the rival pack we were told harbored raiders. She provided the false intelligence, and paid handsomely for my cooperation in presenting it as legitimate to the crown. Lyra felt something cold settle in her stomach, a suspicion forming that she desperately hoped would prove wrong. Did she give a name? Only one, Holloway said. She called herself Mistress Vale, though I always suspected it was not her true name. I never saw her again after the conflict concluded, though I heard rumors years later of a secretive organization operating from the mountains, training orphans from conflicts just like the one I helped manufacture. The confirmation landed exactly as Lyra had feared. The silver-haired woman who had found her in the woods as a grieving child, who had raised her, trained her, and eventually sent her to complete a mission 15 years in the making, was the very same person who had orchestrated the destruction of her village in the first place. The Hollow Moon had not simply exploited an existing tragedy. They had created it, cultivating their own weapon from grief they themselves had manufactured. Why? Lyra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What could possibly be gained from such an elaborate, patient scheme? Destabilization, Ronan said grimly, understanding dawning across his features as the pieces finally assembled into a complete picture. A weakened throne, a kingdom distracted by internal grief and guilt, and eventually, an assassin raised specifically to eliminate the current king when the timing proved most advantageous. Someone has been working for over a decade to create exactly the conditions necessary to seize control once the throne fell into chaos. Who benefits most from a kingdom without a king? Lyra asked. Ronan's expression darkened further. Several rival packs, certainly, but few would have the patience, or the resources, to orchestrate something this elaborate over 15 years. This required someone with access to intelligence networks, financial resources, and enormous patience. Someone close enough to the throne to understand exactly how such a scheme might succeed. The implication hung heavy in the room, unspoken but understood by everyone present. Whoever had orchestrated this conspiracy was not simply an external enemy, but likely someone embedded within the very structures meant to protect the kingdom. Someone whose true loyalties had remained hidden for over a decade, while they patiently waited for their carefully cultivated weapon to finally complete her purpose. We need to return to the capital immediately, Ronan said. If Mistress Vale, or whatever her true name might be, learns that we have uncovered this connection, she will either flee or accelerate whatever plans remain in motion. Lyra nodded, though her mind remained fixed on the silver-haired woman who had shaped every single day of her life since childhood, understanding now that even the compassion she had occasionally shown, the rare moments of what Lyra had once mistaken for genuine care, had likely been nothing more than careful maintenance of a valuable investment. They departed Holloway's estate within the hour, riding hard toward the capital with the weight of a 15-year conspiracy finally beginning to unravel, though neither of them yet understood how close the final confrontation truly waited. They arrived back at the capital under cover of darkness, hoping to move against the Hollow Moon's mountain compound before news of their investigation could travel ahead of them. Ronan assembled a small, trusted force rather than the full might of the royal army, understanding that a large military movement would be noticed immediately and give Mistress Vale ample warning to disappear before they arrived. She will not simply run, Lyra warned, as they finalized their plans in the same council chamber where everything had first come apart weeks earlier. 15 years of patient planning suggests a woman who does not abandon her investments easily. If she senses failure approaching, she may attempt something drastic rather than simply retreat. What would she attempt? Ronan asked. I do not know, Lyra admitted. But I know she trained dozens of us over the years, all raised the same way I was raised, all cultivated for purposes we were never fully told. If she believes her plan involving me has failed completely, she may activate someone else, someone I do not even know exists, to complete what I could not. The thought settled uncomfortably over the assembled advisors, understanding dawning that the danger facing Ronan extended far beyond a single assassin who had ultimately chosen not to complete her mission. Somewhere within the Hollow Moon's mountain compound, other operatives waited, trained just as thoroughly, potentially just as close to activation as Lyra had once been. They departed for the mountains 2 days later, traveling light and fast, avoiding the main roads in favor of paths Lyra remembered from her own childhood journeys to and from various assignments over the years. The mountain compound came into view on the 4th day, its stone walls rising from the landscape exactly as Lyra remembered them, cold and imposing against the gray sky. There will be guards along the outer perimeter, Lyra said, studying the familiar terrain with a strange mixture of dread and determination. Trained the same way I was trained, this will not be a simple confrontation. We are prepared for that, Ronan said, though something in his voice suggested he understood exactly how difficult the coming hours might prove. They approached under cover of night, Lyra guiding the small force through paths she remembered intimately, avoiding the patrol routes she had once memorized as a trainee learning the compound's defenses from the inside. They reached the outer wall without incident, though Lyra's instincts, honed over 15 years, warned her that such ease likely meant something far more dangerous waited ahead. She knows we are coming, Lyra said quietly as they paused at the compound's outer gate, finding it unguarded and standing open, an invitation rather than an oversight. Then we proceed carefully, Ronan said, drawing his sword. They moved through the compound's outer courtyard in tense silence, finding it eerily empty, none of the trainees or handlers Lyra remembered populating the space in her own years living there. They found Mistress Vale finally in the same high chamber where Lyra had once received her final assignment, seated calmly behind the same dark wooden table, as if she had been expecting their arrival for quite some time. Lyra, the silver-haired woman said, her voice carrying none of the surprise Lyra had expected. And King Ronan Ashwood himself. I confess I did not anticipate you would bring him directly into my home, though I suppose I should have expected nothing less thorough from the girl I raised. You destroyed my village, Lyra said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion churning beneath the surface. You murdered my family, manufactured a lie to provoke a conflict that never needed to happen, and then you raised the orphaned survivor specifically to complete what your original scheme could not accomplish directly. Mistress Vale's expression remained maddeningly calm. I gave you purpose, she said. Strength, discipline, a skill set that has served you well enough to survive circumstances that would have destroyed a lesser woman. Do not pretend you regret everything I taught you, simply because you discovered inconvenient truths about its origin. Why? Ronan demanded, stepping forward. What could you possibly gain from 15 years of patient manipulation, from manufacturing a war that killed innocent people simply to eventually place an assassin close enough to end my life? A weakened throne, Mistress Vale said simply, as if explaining something obvious to a particularly slow student. Your father's reign was already unstable when I began this plan, a war he could be provoked into starting, followed years later by his son's mysterious death at the hands of a trusted companion, would have thrown this entire kingdom into exactly the kind of chaos necessary for certain interests to finally seize the influence they have long deserved. What interests? Lyra asked. Mistress Vale smiled, cold and thin. Interests that extend far beyond a single mountain compound, child. The Hollow Moon has always been a tool, nothing more. Funded and directed by parties who prefer to remain unseen, while their instruments do the difficult, visible work. I do not expect you to understand the full scope of what you have interrupted here today. Then perhaps you should explain it, Ronan said, before my guards place you under arrest for treason, conspiracy, and the murder of an entire village. Mistress Vale's composure finally cracked, something desperate flickering behind her pale gray eyes as she realized the true extent of what had unraveled around her. She moved suddenly, faster than her apparent age suggested possible, reaching beneath the table for something Lyra recognized instantly from years of training in that same room. Lyra moved without thinking, closing the distance between them in seconds, disarming the woman who had raised her before the concealed blade could clear the table's edge. Mistress Vale stared at her, breathing hard, understanding dawning that 15 years of training had, in the end, produced someone capable of standing directly against her creator. You could have killed me easily just now, Mistress Vale said quietly. Why didn't you? Because I am not the weapon you built me to be, Lyra said, her voice steady, despite everything churning inside her. I am someone who chooses her own path now, and that path does not include becoming exactly what you always intended, even in this final moment. The guards moved forward to secure Mistress Vale, binding her hands as she offered no further resistance, the fight seemingly gone out of her entirely, now that her carefully constructed plan had finally, completely collapsed. As they led her away, she looked back once at Lyra, something almost like respect flickering across her aged features. 15 years, she said, and in the end, you still managed to surprise me. Perhaps that is the greatest compliment I could ever offer you. Lyra said nothing, watching the woman who had shaped her entire childhood disappear down the corridor under guard, understanding that whatever closure this moment offered would take far longer than a single confrontation to fully process. The conspiracy had been exposed, the immediate danger neutralized, but Mistress Vale's cryptic reference to interests extending far beyond the mountain compound suggested this victory, however significant, was not yet the complete resolution any of them had hoped for. There is more work ahead, Ronan said quietly, standing beside her, as the last of the guards escorted their prisoner from the compound. Yes, Lyra agreed. But for tonight at least, we have stopped what she spent 15 years building toward. They stood together in the mountain compound's high chamber, the same room where Lyra had once received the assignment that changed the entire course of her life, and for the first time since childhood, she felt something that resembled genuine hope rather than the cold, calculated purpose that had defined every day since the fire had taken everything she once knew. The journey back to the capital felt entirely different from the tense, urgent ride that had carried them toward the mountains days earlier. Lyra rode beside Ronan through familiar countryside, watching the landscape shift from rugged peaks to gentle valleys, feeling something loosen inside her chest with every mile that separated her from the compound that had shaped her entire childhood. What will happen to her? Lyra asked on their second day of travel, unable to keep the question contained any longer. She will stand trial, Ronan said, for the manufactured conflict that destroyed your village, for conspiracy against the crown, and for whatever else our investigators uncover as they continue examining the full scope of her operations. She mentioned interests extending beyond the compound itself, and my advisors have already begun tracing financial records and old correspondence to identify exactly who funded and directed her work over these many years. Do you think we found everyone involved? Lyra asked, unable to shake the lingering unease Mistress Vale's final words had left behind. I doubt it, Ronan admitted honestly. Conspiracies this patient, this well-funded, rarely begin and end with a single mountain compound. But we have removed the immediate threat, exposed the lie that started this entire tragedy, and gained enough information to continue unraveling whatever remains hidden. That is not nothing, Lyra. That is a genuine beginning. She considered his words carefully, understanding that complete resolution might remain elusive for months or even years to come, but recognizing also that the desperate, singular focus that had defined her entire life until now had finally given way to something more complicated, more uncertain, and somehow far more hopeful than the narrow path she had walked for 15 years. They reached the capital to find the palace already buzzing with news of Mistress Vale's capture, rumors spreading quickly through the court despite Ronan's attempts to control the narrative until a full investigation could be completed. Lyra found herself the subject of considerable speculation, some courtiers viewing her with suspicion given her origins within the very organization that had threatened the crown, others regarding her with something closer to cautious respect once details of her role in stopping the conspiracy became known. The council will want answers, an advisor warned during their first full day back at the palace. Questions about her loyalty, her intentions, whether she can truly be trusted given everything that brought her into this kingdom in the first place. Then I will answer every question they have, Lyra said firmly, unwilling to hide from scrutiny after spending so many years hiding behind false names and manufactured histories. I have nothing left to conceal. The council convened 3 days later, a formal gathering of every major advisor and representative from the kingdom's allied territories, all eager to understand exactly what had transpired and what it meant for the throne's stability going forward. Lyra stood before them, without disguise or deception for the first time in her adult life, and told her complete story, from the fire that had taken her family to the 15 years of training that followed, to the mission that had ultimately brought her into Ronan's life under false pretenses. I understand the concerns many of you carry, she said, addressing the assembled council directly. I was raised and trained specifically to end the king's life. That truth cannot be erased simply because circumstances changed along the way. What I can offer is this. I chose, when the moment came, not to complete that mission, and when the true architects of this conspiracy revealed themselves, I chose to stand against them rather than allow their scheme to succeed. Those choices were entirely my own, made freely, without external compulsion. Silence followed her words, the council weighing what she had offered against the danger her origins clearly represented. Finally, an older advisor who had served the crown for decades spoke. Character is best measured not by where someone begins, he said slowly, but by the choices they make once given the opportunity to choose freely. I have listened carefully to everything discussed today, and I see a woman who chose loyalty over vengeance, truth over convenient lies, and courage over the safety of remaining hidden. That, to my mind, speaks louder than the circumstances of her upbringing. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber, and Lyra felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized remained tense until that exact moment. Ronan, watching from his position at the head of the council, caught her eye briefly, something warm and proud passing between them without need for words. The following weeks brought slow, steady progress. Investigators continued tracing the deeper conspiracy Mistress Vale had hinted at, uncovering connections to several minor noble houses that had quietly benefited from years of instability along the kingdom's borders, though the full scope of the conspiracy remained a work in progress, rather than a completed resolution. Lyra assisted wherever her knowledge of the Hollow Moon's methods and history proved useful, slowly transforming from a woman defined entirely by her past into someone actively shaping a different future. Ronan sought her out often during those weeks, their conversations gradually shedding the careful formality that had once characterized even their most honest exchanges. They walked the eastern garden together in the evenings, the same garden where Lyra had once studied escape routes and guard rotations, though now she found herself simply enjoying the quiet company of a man who had somehow, against every likelihood, become someone she trusted completely. I never imagined my life taking this particular direction, Lyra admitted one evening, standing beside him near the same wall his father had built following the very conflict that had destroyed her family. Neither did I, Ronan said, turning to face her fully. I imagined a marriage built on political necessity, a queen chosen to secure alliances and strengthen borders. I never imagined finding someone who challenged me, who told me difficult truths when everyone else offered only flattery, who fought for my life even after everything my family had taken from her own. What are you saying? Lyra asked, though something in her chest already understood. I am saying, Ronan said, taking her hand gently, that I would like very much for you to remain in this kingdom, not as a prisoner, not as a political necessity, but as my equal, my partner, and if you are willing, eventually my queen. Not because our histories demand some kind of poetic resolution, but because I genuinely cannot imagine building the future of this kingdom without you standing beside me. Lyra felt tears gather in her eyes for the first time in longer than she could remember. 15 years of careful discipline finally giving way to something she had never allowed herself to fully feel. I came here to end your life, she said softly. And instead you saved it, Ronan said, not once, but many times over, in ways that mattered far more than a single act of violence ever could have. You saved me from an assassin's blade. You saved this kingdom from a conspiracy 15 years in the making, and somewhere along the way, without either of us fully realizing it, you saved me from becoming a king who ruled alone, carrying every burden without anyone honest enough to share the weight. Lyra stepped closer, understanding finally, completely. that the vow she had made as a grieving 7-year-old child had led her, through 15 years of pain and manipulation and eventual awakening, to exactly this moment, standing beside a man whose family had once destroyed everything she loved, only to become the very thing that made her whole again. "Yes," she said simply, answering the question he had asked without quite finishing it. "I will stay, not as the woman 15 years of training built me to be, but as someone finally free to choose her own path, and choosing you, and this kingdom, and whatever future we build together from here." The formal announcement of their engagement came weeks later, met with celebration throughout the capital, and cautious optimism from the surrounding territories still healing from years of manufactured conflict and hidden manipulation. The investigation into the deeper conspiracy continued steadily in the background, promising that whatever remained hidden would eventually be uncovered and addressed, though Lyra no longer carried that burden alone, sharing it instead with a partner who understood, better than anyone else could, exactly what it meant to inherit guilt from choices that were never truly one's own. Standing together on the palace balcony as the kingdom celebrated below them, Lyra thought of her mother's necklace hitting the floor so many years ago, of the fire that had taken everything she once knew, and of the long, painful road that had somehow led her here, to a future she had never once imagined possible for herself. She had been trained to seduce a king and end his life as payment for a debt 15 years overdue. Instead, she had found something far more valuable than vengeance ever could have offered. A partner who saw her completely, a purpose chosen freely rather than carved into her by grief and manipulation, and a future built not on the ashes of the past, but on the courage it had taken both of them to choose something better than the paths laid out before them. The kingdom, at last, had found its queen, not through conquest or manufactured schemes, but through the quiet, difficult courage of a woman who had chosen love and truth over the vengeance she had spent her entire life believing she was destined to deliver.